In the hills of northeast Mexico, a tiny, unassuming village became the stage for one of the most chilling cult stories in modern history. Tucked away from the rest of the world, Yerba Buena had no electricity, no telephones, and no contact with the outside world, making it a perfect breeding ground for superstition and manipulation. It was here, in the early 1960s, that Magdalena Solís, a young woman from the streets of Monterrey, would rise to power as the self-proclaimed High Priestess of Blood, leading a cult that fused religious delusion with macabre rituals. What unfolded in Yerba Buena was a tale of deception, fanaticism, and tragedy. It's a story of how isolation, ignorance, and desperation can lead ordinary people into the hands of a charismatic but dangerous figure. One who would demand human sacrifice and ignite one of Mexico's most disturbing true crime sagas. Magdalena Solís was an 18-year-old prostitute in Monterrey, a bustling city far removed from the desolate landscape of Yerba Buena. Along with her brother Eleazar, who served as her pimp, Magdalena lived a life of hardship. But when two con men named Santos and Cayetano Hernandez came into the picture, her life would take a dark and unforeseen turn. The Hernandez brothers had arrived in Yerba Buena in 1962, presenting themselves as prophets sent by ancient Inca gods. They promised the poverty-stricken, mostly illiterate villagers that hidden treasures awaited those who followed them. If they obeyed, the brothers said the gods would reward them with wealth beyond their wildest dreams. In reality, Santos and Cayetano were small-time criminals looking to exploit the vulnerable population. To maintain their ruse, the brothers hosted bizarre rituals, using psychoactive drugs and organizing orgies in the village's nearby caves. But when some of the villagers began to doubt their outlandish claims, the Hernandez brothers knew they needed to reinforce their power. That's when they brought in Magdalena Solís, believing that her presence would reestablish their hold over the village. Magdalena's introduction to the villagers was as theatrical as it was ominous. In a staged event, she appeared in a puff of smoke, presented as the living incarnation of the Aztec goddess Coatlicue, the deity of earth and death. Her brother, Eleazar, now recast as her high priest, played a supporting role in the deception. What the Hernandez brothers didn't anticipate was that Magdalena would fully embrace the persona they had created for her. As time passed, it wasn't just an act. Magdalena began to believe she truly was a goddess, and that her divine power demanded a terrible price. Under Magdalena's leadership, the cult's practices took a sinister and violent turn. Her followers were no longer merely participants in strange rituals. They became her disciples, obeying her every command. Magdalena's grip on the villagers grew stronger, especially as she introduced rituals that involved bloodletting. She claimed that drinking the blood of her followers would grant her eternal life, a perverse echo of ancient beliefs about immortality. The cult's activities became even more disturbing when she began to enforce strict obedience, demanding sexual submission and total loyalty. Those who defied her, those who refused to participate in the escalating horrors, were subjected to brutal punishments, often at the hands of other villagers. Magdalena's followers were driven to beat, burn, or sexually humiliate anyone who dared to challenge her authority. What began as a con had now become a full-blown cult of personality. Magdalena Solís was no longer just a tool of the Hernandez brothers. She had assumed control, and her followers believed in her divine nature with terrifying conviction. The first real challenge to Magdalena's reign of terror came in May of 1963, when a 14-year-old boy named Sebastián Guerrero stumbled upon one of the cult's gruesome ceremonies. While walking near the caves late one night, Sebastián heard cries and screams that pierced the stillness of the evening. Curious and afraid, he crept closer to the source of the noise and peered into the cave, where he witnessed a scene of unimaginable horror. What he saw was a ritual in progress. Magdalena Solís and her followers were engaged in a blood-soaked orgy, their movements frantic and deranged. At the center of the chaos was the body of a man, his chest exposed, as Magdalena held a ceremonial goblet, drinking the blood that flowed from his wounds. Sebastian watched in terror as the group chanted and danced around the body, lost in a frenzy of violence and mysticism. Barely able to contain his fear, Sebastian turned and fled the scene, running through the night for miles until he reached the nearest town of Villagrán. Breathless and terrified, he burst into the local police station and told his story. His wild claims of vampires and blood rituals were met with skepticism, and most of the officers dismissed his story as the ramblings of an overimaginative boy. But one officer, Luis Martinez, agreed to investigate. Martinez accompanied Sebastian back to the village the following day, but neither the officer nor the boy would ever return. It wasn't until several days later that a search party was sent to investigate the strange disappearance. What they uncovered would confirm Sebastian's worst fears and reveal the full extent of the cult's depravity. The search party arrived at Yerba Buena to find the village in a state of eerie silence. As they ventured into the caves, they came upon a grisly discovery: the dismembered remains of 6 people, their bodies left to rot in the hidden recesses of the cave system. Among the dead were Officer Martinez and Sebastian Guerrero, their bodies bearing the unmistakable marks of the cult's ritualistic practices. When the authorities attempted to confront the villagers, they were met with fierce resistance. A violent gunfight ensued between the police and the Hernandez brothers, who had armed themselves in preparation for the inevitable showdown. Both brothers were killed in the exchange, bringing an abrupt end to their twisted reign. Magdalena Solís and her brother Eleazar, however, were captured alive. During the subsequent investigation, it became clear that the villagers had been wholly under the influence of Magdalena, who had convinced them that their salvation and immortality depended on their loyalty to her and their willingness to perform human sacrifices. In court, Magdalena showed no remorse for her actions. She maintained her divine identity and justified the killings as necessary offerings to the gods. She and her brother were convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to 50 years in prison. Though the full extent of her crimes may never be known, it is believed that she was directly responsible for at least 4 ritualistic murders. Many of the villagers who had assisted in the killings were also sentenced to lengthy prison terms, though some refused to speak out against Magdalena, even after her arrest. The case of Magdalena Solís and the Yerba Buena cult remains one of Mexico's most notorious examples of how belief can be manipulated to disastrous effect. What began as a simple con, a scheme to extract money and resources from a group of desperate villagers, evolved into a full-fledged cult of personality, driven by a leader who was as delusional as she was dangerous. In Yerba Buena, the villagers' isolation, lack of education, and susceptibility to superstition created fertile ground for manipulation. The Hernandez brothers, with their promises of treasure and divine favor, played on the villagers' hopes for a better life. But it was Magdalena who took that manipulation to its darkest extreme, transforming a simple con into a nightmarish reality of blood-soaked rituals and death. Yet the case of Magdalena Solís is not unique. Across the world, similar stories have played out in different forms, from the voodoo-inspired cult led by Adolfo Constanzo in Matamoros, Mexico, to the satanic rituals in Fall River, Massachusetts, connected to Carl Drew. In each of these cases, charismatic leaders preyed on vulnerable populations, offering them salvation in exchange for their obedience and ultimately their lives. More than half a century after the fall of the Yerba Buena cult, the legacy of Magdalena Solís still lingers in the region. The caves where the rituals took place remain abandoned, avoided by the locals who believe they're haunted by the spirits of those who perished. For years, the story of the High Priestess of Blood was whispered about in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind faith and the power of deception. Though Magdalena herself remains behind bars, her story continues to captivate and terrify those who hear it. It serves as a reminder of the darkness that can arise when belief is twisted for sinister purposes, and how easily people can be led astray when they're searching for answers in a world that offers none. In the end, the true horror of Magdalena Solís' case is not just about the violence that occurred, but the fact that it happened at all. that an entire village could be convinced to follow a self-proclaimed goddess into madness, simply because they believed in the promise of something greater. It's a story that even today stands as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the seductive nature of belief.